Hello again, everyone. All right, we're now moving into a new part of our course where so far, we've had an introduction to Ruby so that we can know how to program in this new language, and we've gained some experience with that. Then we dove into relational databases, understanding what relations are, tables, and so forth. We've learned a lot about putting together SQL queries, how to join tables, how to aggregate, and so forth and so on, and even fancy things like outer joins. Now, so we've learned a lot about using a database. But how do we go about designing a database? And this is the part now that we're entering the course, and we're going to focus on this for a little bit, which is the design of the database portion. Later on, we move to the full-on design of a complete application. We'll deal with 3-tier applications. So again, we're going to be dealing with web apps, where first tier is the browser, then our next tier is a web server and business application logic. And finally, we have the database storage component. That's the last tier, the third tier. So right now we're focusing on, well, how do we go about designing that database? How do we choose for our tables and things? How do we come up with these tables? And how do we decide what data goes in which column, which table, and so forth and so on? That's where we're at right now. All right, so this is actually, the reading will tend to be divided. This is the initial set of the reading. Then we'll have more to be able to finish and round out the design. But this is really, I actually think of this as the most critical reading that we do with regard to the design of the databases. It's where we get into the entity relationship model. To start off with, though, I do think I'm going to talk a bit about this, and it's a good thing to look at in Head First SQL, the Chapter 4. And this sort of matches up actually with section 7.8. So that means Chapter 7, and then you'll see 7.8 in the Database Systems Concepts textbook. And this is just a short, like 2 pages, and this is a whole chapter. The Head First SQL author, I think, makes a lot of really nice points and explanations about just the fundamentals of a single table, and trying to convey the importance and the concepts and the ideas of atomic attributes. And what is an atomic attribute, what is not an atomic attribute, and some of the mistakes that people make when they get into just even trying to make a simple single table. And I think that's a good place to start. I'll cover that material. You can take a look at that via the library. You can get an access to that book online. Then we're basically heading through Chapter 6 of Database Systems Concepts, and then we'll touch upon material in Chapter 7 to round off and finish off our database design portion of the course. Of course, we'll be designing database throughout the whole remainder, because we're going to build complete apps, and so that requires us figuring out the database. Anyways, so this is just the introduction to this chapter. Go ahead, take a look at it. These parts with the 3 stars, these are really the critical parts of Chapter 6. So if you're trying to trim your amount of effort or time, or trying to really know what do you really need to pay attention to, it's this section, 6.2, Entity Relationship Model. You feel free to totally skip over 6.3. It's all about dealing with, if you're going to have complex attributes, like, we're not going to have complex attributes. We're just going to keep everything, and we're just going to design it straight off that we keep our attributes simple. And that really means we're always going to just sort of write them out the atomic way that we want them when we make our tables. We don't need to make this harder than it is, and design in our entity relationship model the notion, oh yeah, by the way, I have a complex attribute here, and later you'll need to remember that and turn it into a bunch of simple attributes. No, let's just start with simple attributes and keep them there. So I find section 6.3 something that we don't really need, and it frustrates me that it's there. I don't, or maybe I'm missing it. Maybe there's some critical information there, but I don't like it. Anyway, then you go on to 6.4, this mapping cardinalities. So 6.2 is actually, there's a lot there. And 6.4 is a critical way that we start to describe and explain the basics of the ER diagrams we're creating. So this is sort of, we further build them out here. Yes, take a look at primary keys, take a look at removing redundant attributes. A lot of what you see in the primary key section is stuff that we've already talked about, the need that every table is going to have a primary key. We're going to hit upon that again when we go through design of a table. Sure, it's important stuff, but we're going to pick it up based upon what we've done before and in other discussions. So just read through this sort of thing. Read through what they want to say about redundant attributes. Fine. Sure, we're not going to want redundant attributes because we don't want redundant data in our database. But I think in general, it's not something that we actually have a lot of problems with, because when we go about doing the design of our database, we naturally are trying to avoid this redundancy. And so I don't know if it shows up really as a big problem, but go ahead and read that. But then boom, this is, this is the payoff here. We go from, so this is, these two, 6.2 and 6.4 are really about how do we do this modeling and how do we draw the diagrams that represent our modeling. And so this is kind of the nice thing about this chapter is let's learn how to design a database in pictures. And I love that, it's actually, all right, I get a diagram that shows me my database. It's a little bit like those schema diagrams we've seen earlier, but it's not a schema diagram because it is just a conceptual modeling of what our database is. And it's a really good way to work. And we get to make these entity relationship diagrams. That's 6.2 and 6.4. And then when we get to 6.7, it's, if I have an entity relationship diagram, how am I going to actually convert it into that relational schema? That is, what are the tables I am going to have, the whole thing, so that I can take that relational schema then and go and start issuing a whole bunch of create table statements. I want to make these tables now in my database and have that a real schema. That's where you would potentially have a schema diagram with all the lines connecting things like you had earlier for the university database. But yeah, how do I make the tables? How do I decide? How do I turn the conceptual model of things into something that's real? This logical schema that we use. You can skip this extended features thing. 6.9 is interesting from the standpoint of it's a bunch of, here's some gotchas. These are probably some mistakes that you're going to make while making entity relationship diagrams. It's good to look at that. And then we wrap up the chapter with material. This would be put under recommended reading. In other words, you aren't required to read it. But for those who are interested about what's going on more broadly, these are good sections to look at. 6.10 in particular, one thing that we've seen in management engineering is that, you'll take a course like this one, will teach you entity relationship diagramming, and then you might in another course have an instructor who uses a different way to diagram entity relationships. Now, I don't think we're probably going to really run into that in your time here, but it has happened before. And students are like, how could that be? It's impossible. We were taught one way. And it's like, no, there's lots of ways of drawing pictures. Okay, that's all these are. And so 6.10 will show you, in particular, the point of why you might be interested in 6.10 is it's not so much another instructor uses in a different entity relationship diagram. But that you go off to co-op, you go get a job. The engineers there may have chosen another way of diagramming. Oh, okay. Be prepared that you might have to learn another way of diagramming databases. So take a peek at 610 and go, yep, I acknowledge there are other ways to draw pictures that mean the same thing. Great. 611 other aspects, just that's more general stuff to keep in mind and think about. All right, so this gives you the sketch of where we're headed, what you need to read. Again, these are the really critical parts of chapter 6, and then we're going to get into it. All right,